In his 2016 book, Ghostland, Colin Dickey writes, "Ghost hunting is a thriving, growing business thanks to a glut of reality TV shows that have emerged over the past decade. Starting with Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters in 2004, in which a crew of investigators travel to reputedly haunted locations to trot out gadgetry in search of definitive proof of the hereafter. Add this to the popularity of ghost tours in historic downtowns throughout the country and museums like Merchant's House, which have increasingly added ghost tours as part of their public outreach. You could say that spiritualism, now practiced at Halloween and on reality TV shows, is back from the dead." Is spiritualism enjoying a second coming? Will our advances in technology really bring us closer to the definitive proof of ghosts? Or will those spirits remain in the grave? This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 16, and this episode marks the conclusion of our series surrounding the occult. Since this is a continued topic, it may help to go back and listen to the episodes in order. Also, Mel couldn't join us tonight, as she's out chasing ghosts.
Yeah, so in that introduction, I referenced Colin Dickey's book, Ghostland, which is a really interesting look at our obsession, I guess, as a country with ghost hunting and with places that are haunted. But he actually ends up making a really interesting point, which is something that I hadn't really thought about before, which is when he connects spiritualism, and that's what we've been talking about for the past few episodes, and it was popular at least a century ago, but he connects it to all these modern ghost hunting shows that we have on television. And in doing so, he makes the argument that our modern obsession is less about the ghosts themselves and finding definitive proof, but it's more of a kind of an anthropological study of the living. In other words, he's more interested in why we find certain places haunted and why we are attracted to certain ghost stories over others. So, I don't know, it's really interesting. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. And as far as spiritualism goes, what we've been talking about for what seems like several episodes, at least, like you said, is that, it dates back to this Victorian era. I have not actually read this book myself, so I can't speak to the book's argument, but I do like that idea of this modern day ghost hunting as sort of looking at not just proof for ghosts, but almost why it is that we find things haunted or what gives it that creepy feeling. Like I know a lot of the ghost hunter shows, most famously the show Ghost Hunters, of course, will talk about things like electromagnetic frequencies and other things like that, which, they will use that as a way to discount the fact that there may be hauntings in a place. Well, they'll say, there's exposed wiring here and that generates an EMF thing, and that gives you that weird tingly sensation that makes you feel like something's, crawling up the back of your neck. And so I like this idea that you brought up, though, about how this resurgence of ghost hunting has sort of got a different spin on it, that it's almost like, well, why do we find these things haunted? Or why do these creepy houses sometimes give us these weird feelings? And so maybe, yes, overall, I think it's a cool idea, basically.
It is. And I just can't get over the fact that we, as a people, I guess, haven't really gotten out of this obsession with trying to find out if there is some sort of afterlife or if ghosts are real. Because when you look at what a lot of these reality TV shows today are doing, and you mentioned it with the EMF readers and moving towards a discounting of some of the evidence, it's really not all that different from what was happening in the spiritualist movement, especially when it made a push towards the more scientific aspects of it, because people were trying to discount it, and they were looking at people like mediums and looking at things like Ouija boards or psychics with a little bit of a wary eye and trying to discount it. And it's something we're still trying to do today, but at the same time, there is this still underlying belief in ghosts or in haunted places that we still want to cling to. And so I do think that that's a really interesting question to ask is, well, despite the evidence, or I guess I should say, despite the lack of evidence of ghosts, we still want to hold on to this idea that certain places can be haunted. And that's just a really intriguing idea for me to think about. Why do we need that so badly?
Well, I think that's a great question. And it kind of goes to the heart of, I guess, part of what we're doing with this podcast and part of what horror writers do in general is that, why in particular why do ghosts scare us? Why is it usually that old rundown Victorian home that people think is haunted as opposed to, that new build bungalow down the street or something, we're talking about these haunted places, but I mean, we like, if I say picture a haunted house, most people are probably picturing that more Victorian style house, probably multiple floors, probably a little bit run down, all of those sorts of things. But I don't know what this need for haunted spaces, where it comes from, but we do seem to, like you said, kind of still culturally have it within.
Right, and it is something that's interesting and that Dickey kind of explores a little bit in his book, is the idea that it's not just that we want ghosts to be real, but we want certain types of ghosts to be real. In other words, it's not enough that, Uncle Steve hangs around after he's gone. We want to hear about the woman who was jilted at the altar 100 years ago and never got over her heartache and lived in the home as a spinster and died a lonely existence. That almost kind of romanticized story that we want to hold on to, that means almost more to us than actual proof of the haunting itself. So it becomes a really almost romantic idea of holding on to these stories of our past, and ghosts are almost a literal look at those stories and that history that we have.
Definitely. And I think it says something too culturally that, like you said, a lot of these ghost stories are the jilted woman who died a spinster or whatever, or the La Llorona, that's the woman that drowned her kids in a river and then she, haunts the river crying and wailing. And it's almost like, when someone comes up to you and says, hey, I've got this juicy tidbit of gossip, they never follow that up with, oh yeah, you heard about Joe. Yeah, well, he bought a new car. It's very sensible. It's pretty practical and nice. It's always like, oh, he spent all of his money on it. Like, it strikes me that a lot of those mythological ghosts, like the ghost stories, are based around that same sort of thing. It's that woman who died alone, who always kept to herself, or something like that. It's not just, my house is haunted by my, like you said, Uncle Steve. He died. I come home every now and then and one of my beers has been drank. No, it's something more to it, I guess, is what people are looking for than the mundane ghost.
Oh, Uncle Steve. And this brings up the question, too, of why can't we just leave these ghost stories as what they are, as just stories? But what pushes us then to go sit in the house at night with an EMF detector, with a recorder, and try to prove that the story is true? Because I think that's one thing that especially Dickey would say connects us to the spiritualist movement. But what is it that makes us seek out that evidence? Why can't it just be a good story that we tell each other? Why do we have to find absolute definitive proof that, yes, this place is haunted?
Well, I don't know that there's one answer for sure, but I mean, from my perspective at least, I think a lot of the reason why people are looking for that definitive proof lies in that I guess partly I guess in the fascination that people have with the morbid or the stuff out there. Why are people so fascinated by serial killers or those unsolved murder stories? Why was the first season of Serial such a huge hit? Because it was that question of, did he kill this person or not? I mean, I think it's kind of like that, only with something that's even more unprovable, which would be ghosts in general. So not only do you have this lurid fixation with, let's go find, sit in Lizzie Borden's house where her parents were murdered, but then let's go one step further and see if we can't talk to Lizzie Borden herself. I mean, I think that's where some of that fixation and fascination with Ouija boards come from. But that's just my idea. What do you think?
Well, you said something really interesting that I really hadn't thought about before when you compared it to the podcast Serial and how that was an absolute national obsession for a while. And I wonder if that season of Serial had ended with definitive proof that Adnan was guilty or innocent, one way or the other. If we had some smoking gun, for lack of a better word, that said, yes, he did it, or no, he didn't, I wonder if we would be satisfied. Because I think our obsession with it lies in the mystery of it. And maybe that is what is at the heart of all these ghost hunters, is not so much the end goal of proving if ghosts indeed are real, but maybe our obsession with it is that we know we cannot prove one way or another that a ghost is real or really manifested in front of us. And I think this is something we've talked about earlier in earlier episodes of this podcast. The idea that hauntings are something that are so intensely personal. If you experience one, it is absolutely real to you. But if you try then to turn around and tell somebody about a ghost that you saw, there's always going to be something that can discount it. Well, I had just woken up from a dream. Well, I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Well, I was already scared and worried that this place was haunted. So there's always going to be something to discount it. But maybe that's not why we hunt ghosts at all. We do it for the mystery of it. We do it for the searching because that's what we enjoy. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the same reason that we love unsolved crimes. The same reason that making a murderer still holds our fascination. Because we don't know if we'll ever come to a definitive answer. So we'll always be on that journey of searching. And it's the same thing with ghost hunting.
Well, I think there's a reason why that old show Unsolved Mysteries would not only deal with things like murders that hadn't been solved, but also paranormal things. They would do. I remember there was an episode about a haunted ship or something like that. So I think you're right. There's that overlap, that mystery, that search for an answer when we don't have one. And I was even just thinking maybe that's part of why we have that myth of ghosts. Like the reason why people come back as a ghost is for unsolved business. I mean, you always hear that that's why people stay. They have that unresolved thing that they didn't finish in their lifetime. And so we have this idea of the ghost wanting to have this, unresolved whatever is what's keeping them here. Maybe that is just sort of a parallel with our unresolved question of whether or not the ghosts actually exist or if it's something else. And I mean, I definitely think that, I mean, I hesitate to say that it's something that is like innate in all humans, but I really do kind of almost want to say that I think we all like that idea of closure, that we like that idea of something being definitive. It's the reason why people are so excited for this revival of Twin Peaks, because it was this beloved show that was canceled on a cliffhanger with no resolution whatsoever. And, you know, we like to have that resolution, and leaving things open-ended and leaving things hanging makes us uncomfortable, psychologically at least. And so, I mean, there's some great novels and other stories out there that are really great because they end ambiguously, but they're not something that is something that a lot of people like most of the time.
Yeah, I both agree and disagree with what you're saying, Matt. No, I absolutely agree that when things are left ambiguous, it makes us very uncomfortable. It makes us shift in our seats. We don't like it. But at the same time, I think we're doomed when we have closure, especially with these kind of mysteries, that we're going to ultimately feel disappointed. You know, you bring up the Twin Peaks television show, and I may eat my words later when it actually comes out, but I wonder if people are not going to be disappointed to some degree with it, because they've waited so long to see how it's going to end and how all these loose ends are going to be tied up, that it's never quite going to meet their expectations. You know, I think about a show like Firefly that was canceled to much chagrin. And when they were offered the opportunity to kind of tie up the storylines, I guess, with a movie, people still clamored for more. You know, it wasn't enough closure for them. And so you still hear people, if you mention Firefly in the right circles, they want more. You know, oh, if there was only a second season, oh, if they'd only come back, if they'd only do this, if they'd only do that. It's the reason, you know, we continued the storyline with comic books and graphic novels and that sort of thing. And I wonder if that is maybe at the heart of some of these hauntings and these stories that we share. It makes us incredibly uncomfortable, but at the same time, we can't let it go. We want to know how the story ends, and yet we're never going to reach a satisfying enough conclusion. And so it's going to kind of keep going on, and it's going to be a never-ending cycle in many ways. But I do agree with you. I like the idea of ghosts being a mystery within a mystery, because at the same time we're trying to prove that ghosts are real, we're also trying to find out what that ghost's unfinished business is. You know, why is this person hanging around and Uncle Steve is not? So yeah, I do kind of like that idea of how it's a little bit of a double-layered mystery.
I totally agree that if, like you said, if Serial had ended with one definitive thing, like, yes, Adnan did it, or no, he did not, and we have the smoking gun, I think it would have ended as a bit of a letdown. But at the same time, people would, like you said, would have been clamoring for more. We're like, are you sure that he did or didn't? Are you sure? Well, Firefly, more seasons, more movies, give me more story. It's not enough. It's not enough. I think you've got a really good point with all of that. Well, I think in particular, in kind of doing the background research for this particular episode, one of the things that came up as one of these fairly famous unresolved sort of things is the issue of Amityville, the Amityville house. I assume that our listeners are hopefully familiar with the Amityville movie and its endless, seemingly, succession of sequels and then a reboot with Ryan Reynolds and whatnot. But the original movie was based on a purportedly true story of people who experienced some sort of haunting in their house. And it was a house that there had been a murder in. Well, like I said, doing the research for this episode, we wanted to actually bring up Hans Holzer, who was a fairly well-known in his time ghost hunter, who Holzer wrote the book that ended up being the basis for what would be the second Amityville movie, which was a prequel that told the story of the multiple murders that happened in the house prior to the family that moved in and were the basis for the first book and movie. And that was a murder in which a young man, Ronald DeFeo Jr., murdered his parents and 4 of his siblings. This happened in 1974. Well, Hans Holzer was the ghost hunter who sort of investigated this. And what's interesting about him is that he didn't really seem to believe in angels or any sort of thing like that, but he did believe in ghosts. And so he called himself a scientific investigator of the paranormal. He didn't like the word supernatural. Yeah, so he's kind of one of our more modern ghost hunters.
Yeah, Holzer is, in many ways, I think, almost like the grandfather of the ghost hunters that we have today. He was really popular. In fact, he wrote, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 140 books on the subject. And he did kind of mark a shift from this kind of spiritualist movement where you had these societies that met together and had a very specific focus in trying to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, I guess, that there was a world beyond our own. And he was, yeah, kind of like you said, he was a modern paranormal investigator. And he was one of the first that really became widely known in the public's eye. And Amityville is a really interesting story because I think that does kind of prove our point that we were talking about earlier, in that here we have a story that is very compelling. It's very intriguing. You have, a man who murdered his family seemingly in cold blood, and a family that moves into the house later and experiences all sorts of what we would consider, I think, classic hauntings. But later, the family that worked with Jay Anson, I believe was his name, who wrote the first book on the haunting of the Amityville house that was turned into the first movie, they've actually pretty much come out or people close to them have confirmed that this story was made up. Not the original DeFeo murders, of course, but the hauntings that happened afterwards. And people who have later lived in the house have said that they had no experience in the same way that this other family did. But we're still talking about the house today. So I think that's kind of the perfect example of a story that we just can't let go of in our public consciousness, even despite proof that probably nothing occurred there other than a really horrific murder. We still hold on to this idea that if I say the word Amityville, people know what I'm talking about immediately, and it's a place to be feared. I mean, I don't even think I've seen a few of the movies. I've read the first book. Was one of the first books that really truly terrified me, and I don't think I'd step foot in that house. And so it is really interesting. But Hans Holzer is also a very interesting character because he was actually highly criticized because he did use psychics. And this should sound familiar to those of you who listened to some of our earlier occult episodes on the spiritualist movement, because people even back then wanted definitive scientific proof. They didn't necessarily believe that psychics or mediums could tell us anything interesting. And Holzer was one who did believe in the use of mediums and would use them when he came into his house, when he came into these places, these houses that he was investigating. And because of that, he took on a lot of criticism.
Well, and speaking of Hans Holzer, I guess, really no discussion of modern ghost hunters would be complete without talking about Ed and Lorraine Warren. I mean, if Holzer is the grandfather of modern ghost hunting, the Warrens are pretty much the most well-known, the fathers of modern ghost hunting, the father and mother of modern ghost hunting, if you will. The Warrens, for those of you who may have heard of their name but may not be completely familiar with them, they were the basis for the Conjuring movies. Ed and Lorraine Warren show up there as the ghost hunters who... well, I haven't seen the second Conjuring movie, I know. Shame on me. But in the first one, they are the people that are approached by the homeowners to come check out and investigate. The Ed and Lorraine Warren were well known for keeping all of the haunted artifacts in sort of that haunted museum that they had in their house. It's just it's better to just keep all of this stuff in one place. And so that the actual Annabelle doll that was the basis for that really bad spin-off from The Conjuring was also an actual thing that they investigated.
Yeah, Ed and Lorraine Warren, they're a really interesting couple to talk about, especially when you're talking about the history of the modern day ghost hunter. They are, as you said, two of the most famous. And they did have their famous occult museum. They actually formed, or at least were a part of, the New England Society for Psychic Research, which, if you go and Google either the Warrens or the New England Society for Psychic Research, it will take you to their website, which actually has video of them walking through their kind of homemade occult museum that has, as you said, Matt, collected all of the supposedly haunted objects that they've come into contact with over the years. And you mentioned in particular that Annabelle doll, and I was very disappointed with the movie, if nothing else, because they turned Annabelle from what she was, which was kind of, a Raggedy Ann doll, to this creepy looking porcelain doll that, in my mind, nobody would have in their home just because the doll looked haunted. And when I first heard the story of Annabelle, and I had watched one of their videos where they were talking about Annabelle, it was much more terrifying to see this Raggedy Ann doll behind glass that was like, do not open under any circumstance. That to me was so much more terrifying than seeing this obviously evil porcelain doll. But I digress. Ed and Lorraine are interesting for several facts. The first is that they are very strong Roman Catholics, and that informs everything that they do. And even on their website, there's a quote from Ed where he's talking about how in the Bible there's evidence of angels and demons and ghosts. Therefore, they're out in the real world, and he sees it as his mission to go and help people who are encountering some sort of supernatural or paranormal distress. Interestingly, his wife, Lorraine, considers herself a psychic. So that is her, I guess, contribution to the ghost hunting that they do. And they have a lot of famous cases under their belt. You mentioned the first Conjuring movie, which is based on a family that they investigated. They also apparently looked into Amityville. They were involved in the Enfield poltergeist, which we've talked about in previous episodes, and of course the Annabelle doll. Even interestingly, and I use that term very loosely, they believe they encountered a werewolf. So you can actually go and, again, look up the Warrens' case on the werewolf, which they ended up saying was just demon possession. A lot of these things go back to demon possession for them, and I guess that's that Roman Catholicism coming through. But like Hans Holzer, the Warrens, even though they are very famous and Lorraine Warren has been pretty active even in the past decade. Yeah, their investigations have really come under a lot of criticism from other ghost hunters and a lot of people in the ghost hunting community. I think a lot of people, well, they take issue with, of course, with Lorraine claiming to have some sort of psychic ability. I think there's still that distrust of any sort of psychics or mediums in a ghost hunting situation because it's not perceived as purely scientific, and kind of the same thing that Hans Holzer experienced, and even going all the way back to, like, we talked about with the spiritualist movement, Harry Houdini debunking so many of the mediums. I think there's a natural reaction when people encounter somebody claiming to be psychic that they're just con men or they're trying to take advantage. And so that kind of ballooned with the Warrens, especially because they were involved in so many popular cases that a lot of people, the Enfield poltergeist is a good example. A lot of critics have said that they really didn't have much to do at all with that case, that the British Society for Psychical Research was already there investigating, and the Warrens heard about it, flew over, and kind of pushed themselves into the investigation because they knew it would put them in the limelight, I guess, for lack of a better term. They were seen as a little bit fame hungry, I guess. And people have said that even though the Warrens seem to be a very nice couple and that they maybe even really honestly believe in what they're doing, that they've never really offered, again, we get back to this idea of definitive proof, but they've never really offered enough proof to say that, yes, we did encounter all of these hauntings, or we did encounter these demons, we did cast these demons out. So I think there's a lot of skepticism now when people look at Ed and Lorraine. But I don't know. I don't know if I have opinion one way or another. I'll tell you what, their website, those videos are pretty creepy. They tell some good stories. I don't know if it's much beyond that, though.
Well, and as we've been talking throughout this episode, I don't know that we'll ever know for sure unless somebody comes out and says, yes, I worked with them and it was a hoax and we deliberately were trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. Unless that ever happens, the jury will always, I think, be out about the Warrens and their validity. But, I find them fascinating, too, just for this idea of the amount of investigations that they've been associated with, and by doing, a lot of their work from the 70s up through, the 80s and 90s. That's a time period where we do start to have like more modern technology, video cameras and voice recorders and all those sorts of things that could help prove whether or not these things that they're investigating are real or not. But like you said, we still don't have any sort of definitive thing one way or another, but at least they're trying. I guess my favorite thing about them is that we haven't mentioned Ed Warren died, roughly 10 years ago, fairly recently. And from what I'm to understand, at least, Lorraine does believe that she has psychic contact with him still. And so in some ways he still continues to help investigate. I don't know that she's that active with investigating anymore. She was born in the late 1920s. So I don't imagine that she is too terribly active, but she does claim that she still talks to Ed. So I've always thought that, but then again, my grandfather believed that my grandmother came and visited him after she died. And the way he described it, we all kind of thought, well, I guess it's possible, but I don't know. So
yeah, again, that kind of hits on the paradox of the Warrens, because they can tell a really good story. And if you believe they're credible, then it's really easy to believe that, yes, Lorraine is a psychic, and yes, her husband is still coming through even from beyond the grave. And we don't want to believe that a nice couple like that would be deliberately trying to con us in any sort of way. But at the same time, just because she says something happened, that does not give any sort of proof that would, convince me, or convince many people. But it's interesting because I think she was born in maybe like 1927. So that would put her 90. But I know within the past few years, she has, and I say few, probably in the past decade, that'll be a safe thing to say, she's been on even some of these more contemporary reality TV shows that we talked about at the very beginning of the episode. I know she was on at least one episode of Paranormal State where she acted as a psychic in an investigation and joined the team there that was investigating. And she has been on the show A Haunting. So she still not only is somewhat active, but she's still out there. Again, I don't know. I don't know if this is a point for or against her, but she's still out there in some way seeking fame for what she's doing. So it's interesting to talk about, regardless, I guess, of how you feel about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it is very easy to think that it's quite possible that they are just fame hungry. And maybe they are, like you said, possibly they're earnest and believe this and are hoping to get the fame and fortune through this thing that they believe in. Or maybe they want to be famous so much that they're willing to make up stuff that is not provable or disprovable. I don't know. But, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, and I guess I should admit that I'm probably being a little bit cynical, because just because somebody seeks fame doesn't mean that they're not also being truthful. That goes back to the idea of, I think we discussed in a previous episode, the idea that is a psychic, if a psychic is out there taking money for her gift, does that discredit her any more than somebody who is psychic but chooses not to tell anybody? Some people would say yes. Some people would say, well, just the very fact that she's out there trying to make money proves that she's a charlatan. But I don't know. So just because they're seeking fame in some sort of way, I guess, doesn't necessarily prove or disprove the ability that might be there. And I suspect that it's probably a little bit of both. I think they are very earnest in what they believe, but they're also pretty savvy when it comes to public relations. So interesting couple there, but they definitely lead us right up to contemporary reality TV shows, which we haven't even began to discuss.
I know, right? Well, I mean, what is there to say? I mean, you've got ghost hunters, you've got ghost chasers. No, not ghost chasers. I'm confusing that with the ghost facers from the Supernatural TV show. But I mean, they're starting with ghost hunters, the first and probably most often imitated. But there's just so many, it seems like.
I mean, in getting ready for this episode, Matt, I started thinking about some of the modern day shows that have been out maybe in the past 10 years or so. And I was like you, I immediately thought of Ghost Hunters, even though I think that was what we can consider the first contemporary reality TV show. There were certainly other ones that came before it. You mentioned Unsolved Mysteries would sometimes cover the paranormal, and there were shows like that. But I would think that if you ask most people on the street what the first paranormal research show was, they would bring up Ghost Hunters. But beyond that, I started making a list of this. You've got Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, The Dead Files, Paranormal Witness, A Haunting, Destination Truth, Paranormal Lockdown, Paranormal State, Haunted Collector, Ghost Asylum, Haunted Highway, Deep South Paranormal. And at that point I stopped because I thought, I will never end if I keep naming all these shows. But after Ghost Hunters came out, we did kind of have this explosion of the paranormal research reality television show.
Oh yes, they're everywhere, it seems like. And maybe it's died down a bit since the initial fad has sort of worn off, but I do remember once Ghost Hunters kind of got on my radar, suddenly it's like you couldn't look around for a little while without seeing some sort of thing on Travel Channel, on History Channel, on Sci-Fi, on A&E. All of these different channels were just clamoring for these reality shows of ghost hunting or some sort of paranormal investigation. And man, and if I may, I just have to say, Ghost Adventures, if you haven't seen it, stay away from it. It's terrible. I hate the host. They are the biggest bunch of like frat boy dude bros who I don't know. I've only really seen one episode, and it was because they were going to a plantation that was just right outside of the town that I went to college in, and so I said, hey, they're going there. And oh my gosh, I mean, talk about just psyching themselves up into it. Like it felt like they weren't even really investigating so much as trying to force something to happen. Yeah, it was bad.
I really worried about the future of this podcast when you mentioned Ghost Adventures, Matt, because for a minute there, I wasn't sure which way you were going, and I realized we had not talked about that specific show before we began recording this episode. And I'm with you. That is one that I have absolute distaste for. And, it's not just, and the way you described it as frat boy dude bros is perfect. That nails it down to a T. But it's not just that persona that bothers me so much, which it definitely does. But it is the way they carry out their investigation, because I've never fully understood why, if you truly believe a place is haunted, why you would feel the need to scream at, yell at, badger, exacerbate the spirits that are in there. Because in my mind, at least, if ghosts are real, and if you're willing to accept that premise, then, and you're willing to accept the idea that it's probably a spirit that has some sort of unfinished business and can't move on from this realm, and there's something here holding it there, that they would almost need our help, and we would want to approach them with kindness and respect. And I've never understood that idea of, let's yell at the ghosts to the point that they show themselves to us. And I think that's one of the things that really bothers me about Ghost Adventures and other shows of that kind, is just the general attitude that the investigators will take.
Right. I guess it's sort of like those nature shows where you've got the people that are being respectful towards the animals that they're documenting, and then the people that are like wrestling crocodiles. And Ghost Adventures falls under the people that are wrestling crocodiles. And yeah, like it makes no sense to me either why you would go in and just deliberately antagonize some sort of spirit. I mean, I don't know. It's just not a good show.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that it's just not a good show.
Yeah.
However, there are some of these kind of reality TV shows that I've really enjoyed in the past. I mean, we've already mentioned Ghost Hunters as one of those, and I always really appreciated, because I think that was one of the first times that I had ever encountered people that I really felt were trying to find proof. And even though, yes, they probably did, at the end of the day, I think, believe in ghosts. Otherwise, why would they be out there searching for ghosts? They did spend a good amount of time trying to debunk. And I feel like ghost hunters is where we even get that speech from. You know, the idea of debunking a haunting. And first trying to see what else it could be, what kind of real world explanation we have for this. And then if we eliminate all the real world explanations, well, then what is left over must be paranormal. And now that we've gone through this whole episode series on the occult, and I've seen that there were so many people within the spiritualist movement that were doing the same thing, I can kind of see how history has repeated itself and how it all connects. But at the time Ghost Hunters came out, that was really a revolutionary idea for me, that people could go in and say, this is a haunted place, but first let's try and prove that it's not haunted before we accept that, yes, it is haunted.
Right. And it was the same for me, because when it first came out, I wasn't aware of this Victorian era spiritualism and what it later became either. And so, yeah, it was the same thing for me, where it, like you said, felt like a revelation in terms of, the debunking. And what I always respected most about the ghost hunters was that even if they had a lot of times they would just flat out debunk and be like, no, it turns out this place probably isn't haunted. But even still, if they did pick up some weird stuff, they were usually very hesitant to say it absolutely is haunted. They would usually say, it's inconclusive, or we think it could be haunted, but we just haven't picked up enough evidence yet. So I always thought that was really nice, that it's not either or. Either it is haunted or it isn't, and we haven't disproven anything, so it must be haunted. They were always very careful to say, things are fairly inconclusive. And so, good for them.
Well, and they brought into, I guess, the public forum a lot of these ghost hunting techniques that I, like probably most of the general public, had never encountered before. I didn't know what an EVP was. And that was one of those things that the first time I heard it sent chills down my spine. Of course, now a lot of people discount something like an EVP, because when you hear something interrupting static, it's almost like listening to a rock and roll album backwards. You're going to hear what you're conditioned to hear. But when they were first starting to do it, it was something that was completely novel and very interesting because of that. And even the idea of electricity and how it can affect how we feel. And, if we feel that uncanny feeling when we walk into a room, well, is it a haunting, or is it just that, the electricity in the room is so high that we're picking up on that? And that was things I think that most people hadn't considered before. And certainly every TV show that has followed has in some way followed that same line of investigation that they put forth.
Well, as we're sort of winding down and sort of ending up this episode, because we're getting kind of close to our time that we've set for ourselves, I thought it might be nice to kind of mention maybe a little bit of this lighter side of the modern day ghost hunting. And I will actually, I can't claim credit. I was not the one that found this article, but I will say this. I will make sure that when I'm editing it, I will put a link to it in the show notes so you can read this for yourself. But there's an article in Realtor Mag from the National Association of Realtors called Got Ghosts, How to Sell a Haunted House. And this is a legitimate article for realtors about what to do if you believe that there is some sort of spirit or haunting in a house that you're trying to sell. And it's very matter of fact, and it's a very interesting article. What's really interesting, though, is that they do suggest that you try to be upfront especially if one of the homeowners has seen something. But they do say that considering not everyone believes in ghosts, divulging information about the presence of paranormal activity could lead to people thinking you're crazy. Before you sign a statement saying your house is haunted, you should check all the common sense possibilities first. So right there with what the ghost hunters were doing, as we were saying, and the spiritualists before them. That you may not want to, as a realtor trying to sell a house, jump straight to, hey, so by the way, this house is haunted.
I loved that article. And, in some states, you actually are legally required to tell potential buyers if your place is haunted or not. That can get you in some serious trouble if you don't tell them. But actually, where I live right now, I'm about an hour from the French Quarter in New Orleans. And one of my favorite things to do, of course, is just to, walk around the French Quarter and see everything that's going on around me. But they will actually have signs posted. You'll see like an apartment for sale or a home for sale in the French Quarter, and it will have the sign and it will say for sale. And then underneath it, there will be a smaller sign hanging that says not haunted, which reminds me of that, because I guess they just want to, put your mind at ease. If you're buying a home in the French Quarter, you're probably spending a pretty penny. They want you to let you know that this is not one of the haunted ones. Of course, I don't know why you would buy a house in the French Quarter if you didn't want a haunted house. But, that's just me. That's always been a dream of mine. Buy a haunted house in the French Quarter.
That pretty much, I think, wraps up everything that we had wanted to say about these modern-day ghost hunters. And, in fact, this is our last episode in the series on the occult. So moving forward, our next major series is going to be on apocalyptic literature and stories in general. So if you're interested in the end of the world, we might have some answers for you coming up. So join us again in 2 weeks and find out. Thanks for listening.
This is the No Fear Podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send us an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get special perks such as early access to our main episodes and exclusive mini-episodes released on the weeks in between our normal schedule, depending on the tier you choose. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.